being here. It's so great to see such a large crowd for one of our Distinguished Speakers Series talks. And this means we have a panel. Very pleased about this. The panel is The Making and Unmaking Histories of Settler Violence and Colonialism in the Pacific Northwest. I'm very excited about this. I am Elizabeth Joffrion. I'm the Director of Heritage Resources here at the libraries. And in that role, I provide stewardship with an amazing staff for the library's archives, rare book, and manuscript collections. And one of the things that we do as part of Heritage Resources is sponsor the Jim Scott Fellowship. And half of the panel here are two of our fellows for this year. They'll be introduced shortly. But the purpose of the Scott Fellowship is to do research in the Center for Pacific Northwest Studies collections, one of the units that's part of Heritage Resources, and then report back to the community on what's found there and how those materials might be useful in scholarship. So we are absolutely thrilled to have these folks here today, and I'm going to introduce Laural Ballew, who's going to introduce our panelists. But very quick, I'm honored to introduce Laural. She's Western's first Executive Director of American Indian, Alaska Native, and First Nations Relation and Tribal Liaison to the President. I think you've got the longest title. That's saying something. That's really saying something. Laural most recently served as Department Chair of Tribal Governance and Business Management at Northwest Indian College, a program that she created. So welcome, and Laural will provide our land acknowledgement.
Thank you all for being here. I first want to introduce you with my Indian name, which is Sesiahamia. It's my Lummi name, and I also carry my father's name, Sikatsbatsu. I would first like to welcome you all, and I ask you to join me in acknowledging the place where we gather today on the ancestral homelands of the Laktamish people, the Lummi people, Coast Salish people who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed since time immemorial. Please join me in expressing our deepest respect and gratitude for our indigenous neighbors, the Laktamish people and the Nooksack tribe, for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. So I've also been asked to introduce our panelists today, a panel of historians and educators who will discuss the making and unmaking histories of settler violence and colonialism in the Pacific Northwest. We first have, and I may not be in order, maybe not, Marc Carpenter, a Ph.D. candidate in history at the University of Oregon. His research interests are U.S. history, Native American history, and the history of memory. His dissertation is provisionally titled Memory and Eraser of Settler Violence in the Early Northwest, 1849 to 1929. This research explores the violence of American conquest and colonization in the Pacific Northwest, as well as the mechanics of myth-making that followed. Welcome, Marc. Our second candidate is Josh Cerretti, Associate Professor of History, Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Western. His research interests include sexuality, race, and gender in modern U.S. history. In 2015, he was awarded the Diversity and Social Justice Committee Institutional Transformation Grant to develop and guide the Decolonizing Bellingham's History Tour. His monograph abuses the erotic, militarizing sexuality in the post-Cold War United States. This was a book that was published by the University of Nebraska Press in 2019. Congratulations. Michelle Vendiola, my very good friend, and she happens to be my neighbor. She is a member of the Walker River Paiute tribe of Nevada. She lives with her family on the Lummi Indian Nation. Michelle is a community organizer with the Red Line Salish Sea, an indigenous-led organizing group focused on the protection of water, land, and air in the region. She has worked in education from Head Start through the university level as a teacher, faculty member, and administrator. She has always called herself an activist and believes in empowering Native youth and community members with the tools to overcome historical trauma to bring about community change. Welcome, Michelle. And last but not least, Jennifer Seltz. She's Associate Professor of History at Western Washington University. And, oh, she's our moderator.
I just moderate, yes.
Sorry. Not just, that's a good job. She serves on the James W. Scott Fellowship Review Committee, and her research focuses on the environmental and cultural history of epidemic disease in the North American West. So we welcome you all and our panelists. Thank you for being here.
So thank you to Laural for introductions, and to Marc and Josh and Michelle, our panelists today, and to Beth Gofran for bringing us together, and to Ruth Steele and Ross Custer as well in Special Collections and Heritage Resources for organizing the panel. So I'm going to just speak very briefly about some broad frameworks with conceptual frameworks for this panel, and then I'm going to ask each panelist to speak just for a couple of minutes on their work. In Marc and Josh's cases, that'll be the work that they've done through the Scott Fellowship. Michelle can speak, I hope, about her broader commitments to Indigenous organizing and education. And then after that, I have some questions prepared, but I hope that we can have a kind of organic flow conversation among the panel and leave some time for questions from our audience. I'm really delighted to have such a big group here on not only the first week of the quarter, but probably one of the last beautiful fall days. So thank you for coming out. So settler colonialism in any definition has to involve storytelling, has to involve repeating stories, telling and retelling historical narratives in which settlers have a kind of natural right to indigenous land. There's stories in which indigenous people disappear inevitably, stories of how indigenous homelands quickly become settler frontiers. And my contention is that that's a key part of the mechanics of how settler colonialism works. I don't think that's controversial. These stories are national stories. They're central to settler colonial states, but they're also crucially local histories. Across the United States, which is the nation state that I know best, local history, particularly beginning in the 19th century, was a kind of key tool for creating regional identity, creating the idea of a place called the Pacific Northwest or called Whatcom County, but also for naturalizing American resettlement and conquest, often by, and I think this is true for what becomes the Pacific Northwest, obscuring or erasing acts of kind of everyday violence which didn't rise to necessarily the level of organized armies on a battlefield. And our conversation today, I hope, will look at some of the people in the institutions who created and preserved and also contested those stories over the past century and a half, and who continue to do so now in what's now the Pacific Northwest. And all three of our panelists, I think, based on what I've seen of their work so far, speak to how records that are created by settlers, as well as the laws and treaties and institutions meant to build a settler state and society, can also become tools for interrupting or disrupting colonialism. And I hope that as we begin with the specifics of each panelist's work, we can then move into also a kind of broader discussion of the uses of the past and the present, including the past that's created and found in archives, and and then also of the theoretical frameworks which underlie each of our panelists' work. I did think about beginning with my own kind of broader definition of settler colonialism, but I just decided to punt on that to the panelists. And I think this can be a generative conversation, so I think if we can just go in order down the table, does that work? And each of you just speak for a couple of minutes and then have a broader discussion. Okay, Josh, you're great.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you all for being here. It's great to be up here in the libraries again. I've had a lot of support from the libraries in my work since being here. I've had the opportunity to do some work with both Jen and Michelle. I only met Marc 5 minutes ago, but I like him so far, so we're off to a good start. So for me, I think in thinking about this topic, a lot of my thinking about it is relatively recent, because I only moved here to this region in 2014. Immediately when I did, I was sort of struck with the gap in between the history of this region as I understood it and the way that people in this region were narrating their stories and telling the tales of this place. That gap and that way in which the stories of historical violences get covered over in order to really paper over their ongoing nature really struck me, really concerned me. And so I think in terms of when we're thinking about settler colonialism, one of the most important sort of statements you hear again and again about it is that it's a structure, not an event. And that structure is ongoing, right? And so that we can understand not an equivalence, but a connection between the violences of the 19th century and the things that even this week we've seen happen down at the state capitol in Olympia, where indigenous water protectors are facing police violence, political repression on the site of a Nisqually village on which this capitol was built. And so I think that for me, the way that I decided to engage that was to develop a tour of downtown. And that downtown tour has anybody here been on the tour? All right, a few of us. I got a few out there. And so that's been a real learning experience for me, and it's also been a great opportunity to share the work outside of the classroom. And it's been a great opportunity to interact with people outside of Western who've taught me a lot about where we're at, and I continue to learn. And so my purpose this year with the Scott Fellowship is to fill in some gaps and enhance my understanding of things, and particularly around, so my intellectual background is in gender and sexuality studies. In putting together the tour, I was sort of confronted by the very maleness of the local historical archive, and that you have to sort of dig beyond the surface in order to find the ways that women were actively participating in colonialism and then were also an important part of the resistance to it, and the ways that gender is really central to settler colonialism. So with that,
thanks, Josh. So my name is Michelle Vendiola, and I've been gifted a name through my husband's community tribe, Slokwash, Kaisa, and my traditional name from my home is Tabatoniga, and so I want to introduce myself through those traditional names. And then, like Laura said, I'm from the Walker River Paiute tribe. My ancestors are, my father's from the Lovelock Paiute tribe, and my mother is from the Walker River Paiute tribe, and they're both in Nevada. I've lived here for, I think, around 30-ish years, so I'm not new to the area. We live at the Lummi Indian Nation, and I have 2 children, grown adult children, and 1 granddaughter who's actually being really good back there. 18 months old, so hopefully she'll last for a little while, like the light of my life currently. So I feel like my focus is about doing what we can to preserve our traditional way of life, and what that means is to counteract any kind of violence that settler colonialism has against our communities and against our people, and what that has done in the past and currently doing. So that means as a person who is willing to step forward on the front lines and speak up to that, speak up to any kind of injustices that might be currently happening. I work with, I organize with a group called the Red Line Sailor Sea, where fossil fuel extraction, protesting, like we protest against fossil fuel extraction, and we promote a clean environment and protecting indigenous lands and sovereignty, and especially here in the Sailor Sea region, because that's what sovereignty and self-determination and settler colonialism impacts. I mean, it impacts the way of life of people here currently. And if you think about it like that, then that's the reality of it. That's the basics. The hand, you know, the down and dirty, like right down to the very bottom line. My past is, like that's what I'm doing currently, but I have a history of activism here at Western, and I think that it's really important for students to be involved in student activism, to be involved in their movement building, and what that means to make changes and to do the best that they can to interrupt systems and interrupt and to be someone that moves things, shifts things to a better direction, to something more just. I was a student that came here in the 1980s, late 80s, and was part of the organizing group that brought the Ethnic Student Center here, a group called the Ethnic Student Alliance. We brought back the Native American Student Union from its dormancy in the 70s, and we organized with the Ethnic Student Alliance to bring back the Ethnic Student Center. So I really feel like Western, in its colonial settler, is a colonial settler institution, and we always have to hold Western accountable to being responsible to indigenous people. And yeah, so I think that is very surface of what I am here to talk about, and I'm happy to share more.
Hi, I just got here essentially. I've been here a week. Thank you all for welcoming me here. My part of what I try to do in my work is look at the work that went into both the everyday violence of settler colonialism and into trying to blot it out from the Euro-American record. And so part of that is looking at a variety of sources of the history making, because how people narrate their story of settlerdom is very different depending on the context. Many of the historical societies I look at, the Washington Historical Society, the Oregon Historical Society, those very Euro institutions were attempting to alter the first draft of the history of the Northwest to try and make themselves look good. So they engaged in bitter fights with nationally known historians, bitter fights to try and get their own history out there. At the same time, the history that they told each other when they're in a room reflects a lot more of the violence than the history that they wanted the rest of the nation to know. So frequently in those societies, later on in local historians, you will see people talking about the violence that they themselves committed in ways that you will not see when they are talking to, say, a visiting historian working for Bancroft. You will see anecdotes of violence that in that setting, in that time, were something that you would brag about. So people will be quite upfront about the sorts of crimes that I would say crimes, rightly, the sorts of crimes they committed in the 19th century in a way that they would feel they shouldn't say in other settings, or that they wouldn't say in later decades and years. So the work that I've done thus far here is very much in its infancy, right? I've been stuck in the archives, I can't speak really authoritatively to that, but I can say that is very much present in the archive here as it is in other archives. I've spent a lot of time with the Jeffcott papers, who's a quite famous local historian, and there are lots of letters in there from the settlers talking about the things that they did in a rather blasé fashion, some of which made it into his books, some of which did not. There are also letters from Native people in there, and I want to really always stress Native action. I talk a lot about settler violence, but you can't just talk about settler violence and have Native people disappear, where he wrote them letters asking rather technical questions, and they wrote him long letters back saying, yeah, sure, here's the answers, but I have another story that you really ought to be telling about this thing that happened to my family. And frequently those stories don't actually make it to publication. So in Jeffcott's case, to his credit, he did write up a story based on those Native informants. It's just about the only one of his write-ups that didn't end up getting published. If I figure out why, I'll let you know. In a number of other places, in Oregon, for example, I've got historians who got letters from Native people testifying to violence that was inflicted on their family. And there is no mention anywhere in their work, but they stuck it in a drawer somewhere, they left it in their papers, and now it's still there to find. So one of the things I try to do is look at these collections that are very, very old. These are often some of the first collections that end up in an archive, and try and unpack the story that was there that has since been kind of papered over yet again as the continuing process of erasure goes forward.
So thank you for those eloquent statements. I think one common theme that comes out of what you guys all began with is this sort of twinned questions of audience and of accountability, right? And in different ways, depending on the work that you're doing or the archive that you're looking at, you're thinking about your own audience, you're also thinking about the audience of the sources that you're examining. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about, what you see as your audiences and how different audiences have shaped not only the historical narratives that you're constructing, but the historical narratives that you're looking at or working with or pushing against or trying to make more of a part of public life. Right? So this, what are your responsibilities to different audiences and to the sources that you're drawing on? It's a nice small question. I said specific. Anybody can go. Whoever feels this wants to have anything in there that you'd like to unpack.
I'll do what I can. So I think for me as a non-native person, I think that it's important in doing all of this work to think fundamentally about an accountability to Native people and to Native sovereignty, to not just individuals, but thinking about nations and thinking about the calls they're making in terms of attacks on their sovereignty. And so that is really important. But at the same time, my primary audience, I think, is non-native. And that's who I really try to reach and get at, because a lot of the things I talk about and teach about aren't news to people who have lived through it or their families have lived through it. But then at the same time, I think it's really crucial to try to work back and forth between those different poles and think about ways to challenge non-native people like myself to sort of get into that discomfort, and that the goal of decolonization is something that's much bigger than the university, and is something that in a lot of ways, as a colonial institution, the university puts up a lot of roadblocks to and slows down in a lot of ways. But I think very much because it's a colonial institution, we need to do decolonial work within it. And I think that it's the responsibility of settlers to take up that work and engage in it. When I developed my tour, I thought it was mostly going to be for new faculty coming in. But I've found there are a lot of folks who've been in Whatcom County or Bellingham for a long time who've brought a lot of different things into it. And I've learned a lot from them coming on the tour, and hopefully they've learned a lot too. What I'm struck with very often with a lot of my fellow Western faculty is that there is often a disconnect from this place. And I think some people see place-based work as parochial, and this is a university, they want to be universal, they want to do big narratives and kind of these things that happen at the local level seem very small by comparison. But for me, that's the work that I, at least at this point in my life, am most interested in, most kind of just jazzed on, in thinking about how to do place-based work and how to have a responsibility to a place woven into the work we're doing.
How long is our event?
As long as your granddaughter can hold out. We have the room until 5:30. Okay, and that's right, Beth. Yeah.
Just wondering how much to cover. Okay, because these two, they have a lot to say. So I think my audience, I'm not currently doing research in the archive, and I'm really honored that I was asked to speak here at Western, that the folks here asked me to come up and speak with these two that have received this fellowship, and I'm really glad to be in their presence. However, I'm not currently doing research in the archives, but I think that it's very useful as a tool to uncover some of the historical facts that have happened in our area, and but more could be done. We could put more things in there, as you were mentioning, that don't exist, and we have, for example, records that are events that have happened here at Western that there are no recordings of, the actions and protests that students have done on campus, that there's nothing that you can find a record of, and so it's like it's disappeared. There's like it never happened. So the resistance that students have made against the administration, you can't find much of it through there. You can find a little bit of it in the early 60s or through the 60s, but you can't find much of it in the 90s. And I'd like to see more of that. As far as what I'm doing with my accountability, or who I feel what I work toward is, currently my work is here in an area that we've called the Deep North. And you all probably know what the Deep South is, but here we've come to call Whatcom County the Deep North, because Whatcom County is known for being liberal. Everyone has an understanding of racism and classism and all those isms, and that they don't have much more to learn. But as a person of color, as an Indigenous woman, we know, as an organizer, and as many of you folks who do this work yourselves know, that that's not necessarily true, that Whatcom County has a lot more work to do. And in fact, there's a lot of coverted racism, and sometimes not so coverted, especially when the racism is blatant toward the tribal people in the fishing wars and with fishing rights and what have you. So we've come to call this the Deep North. And settler colonialism, when it destroys to replace, that means erasure, that means genocide. And so when you destroy to replace, you're killing the indigenous people from this land. there's nothing more violent and more deep north than that. So here in the deep north, the work that I've tried to focus on is empowering our people, our own people, to be able to step outside of what I think is respectability politics. What they fear is called what is respectable activism or respectable protesting or respectable social justice, to actually doing something that makes a difference, empowering them to do that. And then also to hold allies accountable in understanding this work. Allies, because their lives are not on the line. So allies can do more, holding allies accountable. And through different various workshops and then what have you, we've done multiple things like that. So I think that as far as what you've asked, I believe that's all I have to say in the time frame that we have.
Yeah, so I think I'll end up echoing sometimes since I'm at the end of the table. I very much, I have a similar feeling to you, Judd, that my work in convincing, Native communities do not typically need much convincing that there was a whole lot of violence in the process of settler colonialism, and there continues to be. That is manifestly the case. So in that way, my audience often is Euro-Americans, and I'm part of the particular parts of the evidence that I'm using, I think, are selected in part because they fit into how Euro-Americans think about history, and then I can go, yes, but also indigenous evidence. But it is useful for its power to say, I have this record, and here is this Euro-American who said that they killed this person. That is a virtually incontestable record. It shouldn't have needed to be contestable. There was already evidence to that effect from indigenous sources, but it's helpful to have another form of evidence showing that same story. I also, of course, feel very responsible to indigenous audiences and communities, and part of how I try to practice that is by sharing sources and tools where I can. So frequently I'll reach out if I find something from somebody's relative to just say, hey, I've got this in a back archive, or I found this story in the back of a notebook, see if the cultural committee already has it, but if not, I can pass it along. At my university, University of Oregon, there was just a pretty large protest by the Native American Student Union against our statue of the Pioneer. It's a big old 13-foot tall dude with a gun and a whip who was put up in 1919. And so I was able to do some of the historical research side of that, to dig into what went into that memorialization, and it was even worse than people thought. And so that was a way of trying to marshal my particular skill set to help the needs of the Native American Student Union that was running that protest. And it did at least, there's a presidential committee, there's always a committee, so we'll see, but at least, it's at least brought the issue to the attention of a lot of the wider community, which hopefully will do some good.
What was the name of the Pioneer?
It's called The Pioneer. It's
Specific person?
That's a complicated question. I have a paper about that. It's meant to represent the pioneer generally. It's specifically, I argue, based on a trapper that the sculptor Alexander Mr. Proctor had met in his youth, who he admired because he had killed Indians. But he used a very different and much ruder word to describe that. But it's meant to be a generalized pioneer, but very much the version of pioneer where violence is at the forefront.
So Laurel's agreed to join us.
Sorry, I couldn't sit back. But I need to balance out Michelle, so I just couldn't contain myself. I think I have some catching up to do, but the first thing that came to my mind as I was sitting there is these ideas of colonialism and settler colonialism. Because I think for you all, it's an event. It's an event for all non-natives, where from a Native American perspective, history didn't start there for us. And that, I'm glad Michelle brought up the trauma and genocide. That I think it needs to be, I don't know, I know historians, people don't want to talk about it, but it's an event that is traumatic and changed the world for Native Americans as we lived, as we knew. If you can imagine living in Bellingham today, and then all of a sudden it was taken over. Hopefully by Native Americans maybe. Let's do that. And your world changes from what you know. Your rights are taken away. Your voice doesn't count. You don't even count as a human being. But in your world, you know who you are. You still have your culture, your language, your family, and that's all that matters. But you're still trying to live it, but the trauma of being taken over. So to me, that's an event, but there's a history before that. And a history that you're not going to find in history books because Mark explained why. You're not going to hear the real histories. You're going to have to dig deep, go visit tribal elders, go to their museums. Because remember, a lot of our history was oral history. And when these settlers came in and took over, their trust was out the window. They feared the white man because they were going to either take their land, take their children, take their life as they knew it. So, why should they share any history with them when these, they were probably good people. Oh God, now I sound like Trump. These well-meaning individuals came in and wanted to know the history. Well, they weren't going to share it with you, so you're not going to find it. And so I think that point was brought up. Colonialism is an event, and and a lot of times people want to, especially non-natives, want to gloss over it and not remember it. And I think I need to shock you all in. You need to remember it. You need to understand it. If you want to move forward and support and recognize with land acknowledgements and support with resources, I think it's important to really know it and believe it, really believe it. Thank you.
So, I can see. So I think some of the things that came up in these answers that I just want to highlight or try to bring together a bit. First, and this is not in order of importance. This is sort of in order of how I'm thinking about it. I think this kind of tension over what a place-based history is or whom it's for, runs through all of your answers in different and really important ways. And I think there's an irony or a paradox in the history that Marc and Josh, maybe particularly Marc, are working on, and in what Michelle and Laural are describing as well, is that part of the idea of a kind of the settler Northwest, this myth in the 19th century in which some kinds of violence were completely erased for a wider settler national audience, also went with kind of embracing the Pacific Northwest as marginal and the fourth corner and in a remote part of the United States, of this large nation. And that, as people have pointed out, is itself a kind of settler colonial move, which rather than saying like this is an indigenous homeland, this is home in the center for the people who live there, instead you cast places as marginal. In a way, local historians embrace that marginality as part of creating their identity. And countering that, it still remains powerful, in order to say like this, this is the homeland of the people who live there, and I can give you a very specific introduction of families, names, and places which are central to understanding and where you are. And so I think that that's a kind of the ways in which definitions of place play into the creation and then the resistance to colonial powers. I mean, I think came out well in all of your answers. Another thing, and this is more within sort of our contemporary context, one of the things that I think is really useful about this idea of the Deep North, and as soon as you said, I started thinking about that, then Marc went right to his story of the statue, is to look at the ways in which across the United States, this version of the past invented in the late 19th and early 20th century, remains key to contemporary political contests. And that's not something that's confined to Charlottesville or North Carolina, right? That this is something that we can see in the West and in the Northwest. And I think that's it's useful then to go back and to look at, when you said it was as bad as you thought in 1919, in your conventional work. Talk about what that is. So that the work that these panelists are doing is a way to kind of rethink what local and regional identity means in the United States. I think is really is important and sort of useful on that. And Michelle also anticipated a question that I was going to ask for the whole panel is this is the kind of question that historians are not supposed to. They're not supposed to talk about the present or the future, but if you could see a kind of archive of contemporary struggles against settler colonialism or contemporary, what would a contemporary archive look like? I mean, you talked about this as Western should have a better record of student resistance since the 1960s, right? And would be kind of a history of Western as a colonial institution, or an archive of Western as a colonial institution. A couple of you have brought that up as a phrase, and I think maybe that would be useful to elucidate. What does it mean to talk about Western or any public university in this part of the country as a colonial institution? How does that, how do you grapple with that in your work, including in archives found in universities? Again, we don't have to go in order, John. Whoever feels inspired, yes.
I can jump in real quick. I'll be short. I think one way of doing that is to try and get archives on site early. So not to keep talking about that statue thing, but one element of that project was going and talking to the archivists at University of Oregon, and we've kind of got them. They've got a pre-selected spot for us essentially as conversations, as protests, as whatever else goes into this. They are ready and waiting for those to go in there. There's been a short series of interviews with some folks talking about what it's meant to them in the past and in the present. And so the idea is that as NASR goes through this process, that there is going to be at least some of the parts of it that people want to go into an archive will be there. So there will be a record of this as this goes forward. So that's kind of the softball version, but I think that's one thing that can be done.
So that has happened here, and it really is put on the responsibility of the students to submit that work to the archivist in order for it to become archived. And students are already really overtaxed and very busy, and they get like forgetful or whatever to bring that materials to the archivist. My husband, who is the former Ethnic Student Center director, coordinator here at Western, actually worked with the archivist to set up that system here at Western so that students, ESC student clubs, could archive their history throughout the time. Their club organizers could put their history here at Western, and few students have actually done that. So if you're a student club leader or part of an organizing with the club, you can put your documents in the archive, and they already have it set up for that to happen. So that is also a really cool thing. It's just that it's not very complete. It's not very full. One of the things that I was just looking at that I was sent today, actually he sent it to me too, Michael. This woman, Rebel, she's an ethnic student center scholar, or ethnic studies center scholar. She received a Genius Grant Award for doing just this. Her name is, Kelly.
Yeah, Kelly Vital Hernandez.
Right. And she archived materials that were able to help people win cases against police violence and things like that. So struggles that were where documents that were likely to be destroyed by the police were able to be archived. And that's a really awesome thing because, a lot of times those are the first things to be destroyed so that they can't be used against the system. And I think that Western is a system, so that's one of the first things that could be destroyed is any kind of document that looks bad on Western. So I think that that's where any kind of moderation or how anybody who wants to look at a document and say, well, that's not appropriate to put in our system, we can't have that. So this person was able to look at the archives in a way that allowed a voice to underrepresented groups that were being targeted.
Well, I think that, one exciting thing about the contemporary moment, I know many of us, especially historians, are used to decrying technology in a number of ways, but I think a lot of digital archives have really opened up access to these alternate stories or to these stories that have multiple voices. And so I think about projects like Lisa Brooks, who's an Abenaki historian, has a website called Our Beloved Kin, that she's gone into these archives in these very ivory tower, Ivy League institutions like Harvard and Dartmouth, which were both founded as Indian colleges to educate Native people, but to bring these documents that have been out of sight and out of mind and inaccessible to most people besides a narrow group of professional historians and archivists for a long time. And so in thinking about, I don't know exactly what would be in the Rebel archive, but I would hope that it would be accessible to more people. And I think that hopefully events like this get some new people to come to the archives, the Goldsmari building and the archives here on campus. But I think we're also seeing a lot of really cool projects happening all over the country, all over the world, where people are trying to figure out how do we use the tools that exist in order to make it so that broader and broader audiences can access this material and then put it to use too, right? To not just see it, know it's there, not just to write about it for other scholars or for your circle, but to think about what are the things now we can do when we're armed with this knowledge.
I wonder then if you can go from that and if I push back on that a little bit and talk about the memories and records of trauma and of violence and how and the kind of the sensitivities of doing those both in sort of writing for, presenting for what may be predominantly non-native audiences, or, I think as both Josh and Marc have said, have in some cases what your work does is take things that are histories and stories that, indigenous communities may have already had, and putting them in a different form, and how you might think about that, and then for everyone on the panel, like to what extent does the kind of goal of archival collection completeness also run up against dealing with stories of trauma and violence?
Can you repeat the last part?
How does these goals, the goal that you talked of collecting completely, right, representing all voices, but does that conflict with also what to do with memories and stories of violence or trauma? Maybe they don't. But it seems like that may also go back to the sort of question of audience, right? For whom are these stories for? Right? What different purposes might they have?
Well, first off, I don't look at them as stories. So if you're talking trauma,
No, I didn't
is there
mean to-
actual...
it's not to indicate fiction.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and did you say something about rewriting it, or what was your, repeating it?
repeating it or retelling.
Retelling.
Yeah.
So, I think my own opinion is retelling or retelling just takes away and does a disservice to the person who has written it. Because if I were to write, first off, if I had the nerve and the even the strength to even write about trauma, because let's first remember that a person has to find that strength, and God bless them if they can write it and have the strength to share it and hopefully help another individual. But to retell it, I think, would do a disservice. I mean, you can share it if they're willing to, but that idea of retelling just takes away, and their own story is, what their actual truth is. And then what was the other question about?
Well, I think maybe I can rephrase this. Any of my students know I do this in class too, just to make things too complicated. Because whether both Mark and I'm going to use sort of Mark and Josh as examples, but not necessarily work as examples without redirecting the question to them. Both of the histories that you're working with in the archives are sometimes histories of violence, right? So then what is the kind of the balance then in how to use sources which are recounting things which were perhaps the worst thing that happened to a person in their lifetime, right? Or someone else. What's the responsibility as bringing those stories up to make clear this was the actual cost without.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think first and foremost is bringing up the accurate history and all of the history, because as historians and in our archives, you may only be finding one side or some half-truths, but seeking that whole history. And, just to really face the fact that trauma is trauma, and there were atrocities that happened, especially during settler colonialism. There were a lot of atrocities, and I was thinking about this just recently, and I don't mean in any way to diminish anyone else who has been through this, any other country or culture, but I just feel like, this is me personally, as a Native Indigenous woman, that we see and hear a lot about the atrocities of a lot of other cultures, but nobody looks at what has happened and is still happening in the US. And I'm still trying to figure that one out. So I think as I speak to you historians that we really need to get the whole truth and find those brave souls that are willing to share their stories of those atrocities.
I think as you both point to it, there's an impossible balance to sort of strike between thinking about how we can only know about these events through kind of telling the stories, but that telling these stories are really traumatic re-traumatizations for a lot of people. And so I try to be conscious of the fact that when I encounter this material, I mean, when something strikes me, that I know that my positionality allows me to sort of engage this material without the same weight that a lot of other people might come to it. And I think one of the big challenges is thinking about how we maintain that space for the agency of indigenous people and other people who are fighting colonialism without losing sight of that structure that determines so much of people's lives. And so I think about I'll briefly digress into a little historical storytelling. So the man who's the founder of the town of Seahome, Edmund Fitzhugh, and so he was both one of the founding investors of the Bellingham Bay Coal Company, and he was also the Indian agent appointed by the U.S. government for the Lummi. And he married two indigenous women. He married an indigenous woman, impregnated her, and then decided he wanted a second wife. And these women eventually, in a physical confrontation with him, overcame him. They beat him with a piece of firewood, escaped from his control, and lived out the rest of their lives away from him. He, speaking of the deep north, quit his job here and moved back to the Confederacy to enroll in the Confederate Army. So one of the founders here, right, has got that deep ties to the Confederacy. And in telling this story, it can be a great story of indigenous resistance, right? That these women wouldn't put up with this man and they fought back against him successfully. But at the same time, I can't even begin to imagine what these women experienced, right? And the suffering that they went through. And so in telling that story, we've got to try to hold both the sort of resistance and the oppression and domination. And I don't think that that story can be told just with one way to get all that's in there. And so I think that it's an ongoing balance and requires thinking about different audiences and requires being self-reflexive about our own positionality to find that space in between re-traumatizing people and telling an as honest of an account as we can of traumatic events.
I can jump in real quick on Fitzhugh, if I may. So actually, in our archive just down the street, part of that story was told by those women's family, by Harriet and Ruth Shelton, who wrote to a local historian. That's the thing I was talking about earlier, so since you brought it up, who was asking technical details about Chief Seahome, and they said, let me tell you about Fitzhugh and how he's terrible and how I wish he was alive so I could kick his head in. And so in that case, I feel like they were sharing, and to be serious, they were sharing a traumatic event that had happened to family members, but they very much wanted that story told. So when I find a letter like that, I do have this deep tension where I don't want to re-traumatize, where I don't want to push people, obviously, to tell stories they don't want to tell, but where somebody wrote in the past or the present and said, tell this story, then the choices get very, very easy. Those people who wanted that story to be out there so that people would know that Fitzhugh was terrible, I can't not tell that story, right? I have an obligation now that I've read it.
What were their names? Does anyone know?
Who?
The women.
Yes, but I don't have them in my mind. But I have them in my notes. Come see me, and we'll chat.
So I'm just going to go back a little bit because I know that we've talked a little bit about what is a little bit about settler colonialism, and sometimes people have different interpretations of settler colonialism. So I'm going to read what I understand to be settler colonialism. So it's just a numbered list. So 1, first settler colonizers come to stay. And that's different from other places where colonizers go, extract resources, and leave. So settler colonizers come to stay. Settlers intend to permanently occupy and assert sovereignty over indigenous lands. 2, settler colonialism is a distinct type of colonialism that functions through the replacement of indigenous populations with an invasive settler society. Settler colonialism destroys to replace. 3, it is a structural system, not an event in history. In this sense, settler colonialism does not ever end. 4, it denies the existence of indigenous people and the legitimacy to claims to land. 5, it aims to banish indigenous people and replace them with settlers. 6, its logic of elimination requires the removal of indigenous people of a territory by any means necessary: homicide, child abduction, religious conversion, reprogramming, via missions or boarding schools, and a myriad forms of assimilation against settler colonialism destroys to replace. 7, it continues to dispossess indigenous people. 8, it promotes white supremacy. 9, it requires arrivants to participate as settlers. And these are not my own thoughts, they're from Eve Tuck and Patrick Wolf. You can find those in their writings. So, you know, as far as my thinking, as an Indigenous woman, I feel like research has been really, has a negative history on our communities. And anthropology has a lot to do with that. Anthropology was a field that was created to research indigenous populations worldwide, and especially here in the United States or North America, Turtle Island. And that's a bloody research history, you know. They dug up graves and they did all sorts of nasty things. And those types of practices are what prompted your human subjects requirements to like get that IRB before you do your research. It was that prompted it. And so because of that nasty history against our tribal people, research is pretty bad. In our opinions. I mean, a lot of stuff, settler colonialism has been pretty bad in our communities. And so when I think about non-indigenous people coming to our communities to extract indigenous knowledge, our indigenous knowledge, whatever it is, our stories, our medicine, our way of life, our culture, whatever it is, that's indigenous knowledge. And going back to the ivory tower, to a settler colonial institution, and writing about it to publish, and to say, you know, because it's a recognition. What type of accountability do they have to us? Sometimes they don't ever go back. Sometimes it's just like it's a notoriety, and so it can also still be not a good thing. You know, just to pick the brain of our people, pick the brain of our communities, and then just like float around through the academic field, academic circles, and say that they've created these theories, when those theories or those ideas and concepts have existed in our people's minds, our people's lives, our people's heads. So yes, I think that that is what I think of what research is, and what you're asking, how when you push us to talk about researching in the archives and researching first source materials, that's what it really means to me. And if you're a non-indigenous person, we're going to hold you accountable. At least we talk about that, and it gets frustrating. So yeah, I think that's about what I'm going to say on that one. But I feel that you know, that we have a turtle island from North America through, you know, South America. Indigenous people have had the same similar struggles, especially with what's happening contemporary and with standing resistance to what's happening with our land and settler colonialism. And when you see what's happening with the burning of the rainforest, that's settler colonialism. And that's the taking of the land for extractive resources. And when you see what's happening in Canada for laying a pipeline across Indigenous territory, that's settler colonialism. And when you see what's happening in Olympia with the water protectors, my friends, holding ground at the Capitol to stand up against the LNG plant, who is trying to put the LNG plant on tribal unceded territory, that's settler colonialism. So it's all connected. I spoke about this before, but we're witnessing. I got to visit Brazil a couple of years ago in the summer, and what I saw there, I spoke with some of the indigenous people, and their stories are, you know, not stories. Their lives. They shared what happened in their lives, in their communities. Some of them have been flooded out for the dams. Some of them have been flooded out for these extractive resources, and some of the corporations have come in and outright murdered them so that they could put up these dams for extractive resources. And this is not far off to what's happened up here, except we're a little more protected. But I think that, as we know, climate change is not far, like we're not far behind that. And the first people that are going to be impacted are indigenous communities. The first people that are going to be on the front line are indigenous communities. And so we saw that with Standing Rock. Those were the people there that got turned on right away with our own government, with our own weapons. And so I just want to say that those are the 2 points I need to make before the end of the conversation.
I think in a second then we'll see, or also if we're willing to take questions from the audience as well. I want to thank all the panelists and Michelle also for what you just said in particular, and I think for raising this question of this unresolvable tension about how to work, particularly as within the institution of the university, and what it means to be trying to do research better than solid anthropologists or others, and for different purposes within the university. And I think that's not something that we're going to resolve at this moment here, but it's an important tension to kind of hold always. The definitions of settler colonialism taken from the text and Patrick Wolf's work, and what you closed with in discussing crises in Brazil. One of the things that I think is useful about settler colonialism as a theory is it's a way to get out of American exceptionalism, right, and to see what the history of the United States in a comparative context as well. And that's not only something that defines the 18th or 19th or 17th centuries, but is also important to understand as contemporary structure and events. So thank you for that reminder on that. So with that, we do have about 20 minutes left. So if there are questions for any of the panelists. Okay.
Hi. So I arrived a little late, so I didn't get the names, but I did it right in the middle.
Josh.
Yes. You mentioned something early in the talk about some roadblocks set up by the university that somewhat limits potential action at colonization or something of that nature. Could you elaborate on what you think those roadblocks are and what steps we could take to perhaps take those down?
Well, I think I would say that a good roadmap to that is the Native American Student Union a few years ago issued a set of demands, which began with bringing our new tribal liaison to campus here, and continued through a number of really important asks, thinking about the physical presence on campus, so thinking about a longhouse and or welcome pole, thinking about verifying tribal enrollment for students that are coming in. If you Google NASU demands, you're going to come up with that full list that I think articulates better the roadblocks that are up and the steps that need to be taken better than I could myself.
Do you have anything you would add to that?
We have an author of that document here in the room. I don't know if they want to come and speak to that or if they feel comfortable. No, they don't. But there are 5 demands, and the 5 demands are to get a tribal liaison, which has never existed before, and Laural is here. So the second one is to get a Coast Salish longhouse, and we're one of the only universities on the in the Northwest or the state of Washington, all the way from BC through Oregon, that does not have a longhouse. So Western Washington University has refused to recognize this place and the Coast Salish people, even though it's not the first time that it has been thought about or talked about. So that's one of the demands. A third demand is to provide funding for some of the organizing that Western has taken responsibility or credit for over the past several years, and putting it on their website as diversity recruitment efforts, when really it's students through their blood, sweat, and tears have raised their own money to put this event on, and it's the powwow. So they've asked for full funding for this event so that they don't, if Western's gonna use it and promote it as such, that they need to be paying for it. That was the third one. A fourth one, what was that, 4? Was to identify who is enrolled here as a Native student through tribal enrollment and through tribal descendancy. And because anyone can mark I'm a Native American on a box, and it can puff up the numbers to show that Western has a lot of tribal students here, but that's not real. So NASU wanted Western to actually show who's Native in this institution by tribal enrollment or tribal descendancy, because you can, a Native person knows how to like show their tribal descendancy on their own, with their own people. And then the fourth one, oh right, government to government relationship training, because Western is a government institution. Understanding what that means with getting another government training through the state of Washington, and through that realizing that they have to work with tribes as a sovereign nation, as another governmental agency, because tribes are another sovereign nation. So understanding that that is a particular governmental agency to work at, because students who are Native American have another level of commitment that the university has to respect and commit to as it within the treaty. So those are the 5 demands, and I think you could think about what is settler colonialism within that context.
I need to respond to that letter, which we refer to as the red letter. And I'm so happy that Michaela was here, but hopefully Michael has heard this. And Michelle, it was through the actions of the Native American Student Union Group that my position is, that I'm here today before you. So for me, that shows Western's intention of giving our Native students a voice at the table, because that's what I am, and that's what I take to my heart. And my responsibility here at Western is not only to the administration, but first and foremost to the support of the students, Native American students. That's what I take as number 1. And Michelle, I have taken those 5 demands and created those as my first year goals and objectives. And I'm really happy to report to you, I'm so glad I can tell you face to face that I have been able to tick off 4 of those demands. The only thing remaining is the longhouse. But we are, I can promise you, we are working towards building the support, and we will have a longhouse here on Western's campus.
Sorry, I couldn't resist either, but I think, Laural, your point about being accurate with history, that's how you understand the barrier, is like going and reading about the experiences of Native people in education, not just higher education, but what do those experiences mean, what have they done to our communities, and how are non-Native people implicit, right? And so, like, I think when we're talking about contemporary settler colonialism, and I was just sharing with Raquel, like, an institution that emphasizes language so much, yet then you have a space where, like, words like Kolshin or Salish or Shuksin are being thrown around for business, you know, like that to me is contemporary settler colonialism, right? So how are we complicit when we can have Shucks in middle school but not take care of our Native children that go there, right? And so when you talk about barriers, it exists in like not only policy but like human existence and our inability to understand Native people, our inability to not want to work with people who are different than us, maybe, or we don't understand. And so barriers often exist in turn, like human forms, right? Like whether I go to the financial aid office and they're rude to me because I don't know what to do, or you know, this system was not built for Native people. And so I think that's how you understand the barriers. There's no, a panel's not going to help. It's going to be something that you have to go do the work if you're truly committed to that.
If I can maybe hop on real quick. I like you bring that up, that human connection, because I think that's something that can sometimes get lost when we talk about theory. That settler colonialism is not a mystical ghost floating somewhere. Settler colonialism is perpetrated by people, and it can only be undone by people, which is good, because then people can, it can be undone by people because it's not just because it's a force that we've identified and named and that's useful, at the end of the day, it is always still people that are doing things.
I just said this is more just a plug for the value of doing local history for students that are looking for projects and papers. There's a history that's findable about why the middle school is called Shuxley Middle School or Colonialism Middle School. This is why the kind of detailed local archival work is important. You can find out exactly when these decisions were made and contested, and then they seem to look like common sense, but they're not common sense. They're just historically created, right? And that's findable. We have sources and archives for that, many of them on this campus too.
Can I ask a question really quickly about that? Coming into this institution or any institution of higher education as an archivist and understanding that there was cultural appropriation that now I'm expected to work with, it's become very important to me, and I've written about this, working to develop relationships, to apply indigenous knowledge and to find out, to work with that. And I was wondering if as the historians, folks on the panel can talk a little bit about that relationship building, about outside of just being in a panel, how do we work together to provide shared stewardship over this cultural heritage? Who does it belong to? It doesn't belong to us at Western. It was taken. So how do we work with this in this context and build those relationships? Big question. I think that's what I was hoping to open with this discussion, the awareness that this cultural heritage is appropriate for Western.
I think, well, culturally and traditionally, our protocol is to go to the elders for advice. And I think it would also, we would need to know which tribe are those archives, those whatever that is that you're holding, because then we would need to bring in those tribal elders or their officials and ask them, because really that's who it belongs to, is that nation. Okay, good to hear. We're thinking alike there.
Let's keep it going. Let's keep that conversation.
Thank you for that question, though. That's good to know.
I was wondering if you could just kind of off the top of your head give some kind of things that I might want to look into if I'm interested in reading more on this topic or reading more about Native history, specifically about Vendiola.
So I think one of the best books to get as you're starting out on this path of learning that should be ongoing for a long time is called A Totem Pole History. And it's focused on the work of Lummi carver Joe Hilaire, who has a pole down in front of the Whatcom County Courthouse, as well as in Kobe, Japan, in Seattle, at Port Madison, a number of other places. And it's a really great book, not only because it brings you through a lot of the history and of the art, but also because it's one of the first books on the topic to be predominantly the words of Lummi people in it. And I would also really recommend Harriet Shelton Dover came up briefly. Her book, Tulalip from My Heart, which was a Western Reads book a couple years ago. She's from the Tulalip tribes, a little bit south of here, but it is very much tied into this region's history and is a fantastic first person's account of a woman born right around 1900 who had an enormous effect on the fortunes of the Tulalip tribes throughout the 20th century. So, Totem Pole History, Tulalip from My Heart. Once you read those, come see me and I can
I was just going to say, in response to your question, Nixa Brados is a environmental studies teacher who offers at least 2 courses on native environmental environmental resources and like the history of their rights and struggles, and he's written some really good books on that and spent a lot of time with sort of his tribe. So you can just go to his office and talk to him or take you to those classes. They're really good.
What was his name?
Nick Zaffaratos, Environmental Studies.
There's also there.
I knew I saw one somewhere.
There are two books that are not about this rebellion, but I think are still great books. One's by someone who's a Western grad, a historian at UBC named Cole Thrush, called Native Seattle, but his history in Native Seattle. And the other one is by another UW historian who's a Skinhoma sharp member, Josh Reed, about the cause of whaling called
Thank you.
The Sea is My Country, yes. See Patrick Mellon.
It's important for non-native folks who come face with their colonialism and how they're perpetuating that, how they're complicit, and to reflect on their thought structures, which are sometimes subtle, that allow us to continue. I heard another good idea the other night that white folk are displaced from their own lands, their own indigenousness, say Europe or wherever, and the atrocities that people might have seen before. Would you say this is an important idea to maybe white folk or non-native to dig deep in their own displacement from being indigenous?
Can I just say that y'all weren't displaced? Like,
Big
that
difference.
was, yeah, yeah.
Say again,
There's
sorry?
they're like calling the settle of like displacement for you is just like not the reality. That word makes it sound like you were taken away from your home when a lot of it was choice and destroyed lives. So please don't call it displacement.
I think there's a long history of settlers wanting to claim indigeneity, and I would say that that move that you're describing is part of that. I think, to me, as a non-native person, empathy is one thing and appropriation is another. So and as a historian, yeah, that's imprecise vocabulary. So, I mean, reflecting on why people move, isn't it right? Makes sense, but there are different reasons. There's different scales of that. So that doesn't seem fruitful to me as a non-native historian. But I don't know if others have more comments on that.
So we seem to be spiritually disconnected, I guess, to say, from the land itself.
I think that comes from, to me, and also as someone as an environmental historian, that a feeling of disconnection is not the same as actual dispossession. There's a long history too and valid reasons for feelings of disconnection, but it's a distinct process, and in some ways it's a process that has been linked to settler colonialism itself. So I'm happy to give you more meeting on that, but we're running out of time.
Hey, I would suggest that you educate yourself a little bit about the history of the doctrine of discovery and what that means as far as how the intention of land is taken over through white Christians and white supremacy. So in short, brief terms, Europeans, the monarchy, white Christians felt they had the God-given right to take over lands that were occupied by indigenous people because they were subhuman in their opinions. And they claimed territory like this land as their own, even though they didn't occupy it. And other places, Africa, Australia, other places, because they felt that they had the God-given right. That's what you're talking about. And then here, it's different because when England came, they set up a different rule about having to physically be here in order to claim the land. And so that particular part of it is not a displacement, it's a change in the law and creating manifest destiny in order to actually take the land over and overrule the doctrine of discovery and the little laws that they came up with the church. And so educate yourself on that. Don't get wrapped up in the I'm a pagan white person from far back. I need to like find my roots and we're all the same human being thing, because that's not the case. There are actual laws that were made that made this happen. So I would suggest you read up on that.
There still are laws. There still are laws.
So maybe we have time for one more. Oh, I'm sorry. I keep not being able to see you past the podium. What's the problem?
I was just curious about what theoretical framework maybe some of y'all are working from, and I just wanted to say to my fellow white people in the room that there's a job on our part and that we should be collecting ourselves, and that it shouldn't just happen to be Native Americans in the room to have this talk and have our guidance. And so if everyone's open to building a way for white people and white settlers to do this work, I'm really looking to get into that and create community. But yeah, theoretical frameworks.
So for me, I think probably the most important, or the person that's had the greatest influence on my thinking on this topic is a woman named Teresa McCarthy from the Onondaga Nation, Haudenosaunee, Iroquois. She has a great book called In Divided Unity, and she taught me a great deal. Before moving here, I lived in Buffalo, New York on Haudenosaunee territory. I learned a lot from a lot of Haudenosaunee intellectuals there about the importance of thinking about place and centering place and finding ways to move out of my own sort of frameworks. And so I would highly recommend Teresa McCarthy's In Divided Unity.
I'm also, I don't know if I mentioned, but I'm also working on my dissertation, and I'm using an indigenous methodology, which is the only authors I would suggest is Linda Smith and Sean Wilson. Thank you.
Throw in Peter Nabokov's Forest of Time, which I think is a very useful way of kind of talking about divergent and potentially difficult to reconcile senses of history, recognizing indigenous history as having its own sense of time and its own logics, and that's varied by nation because there's not one indigenous history, of course, but I think he does a good job kind of looking at that and taking that seriously as a different fountain of knowledge. Peter Nabokov, Forest of Time, 2003, I think. Forest of Time.
I have two questions about two books that I have read and want to know if you recommend or not. And one is The Other Slavery, about slavery of Native Americans in this country, and the other is Roxanne Dunbar's Indigenous Peoples' History in the United States.
The first one is Andres Rosales' book, The Other Slavery. It's Andres Rosales. Yeah, I think that's a great book.
Yeah, I think both seem quite good, and I think it's one of the biggest things is just continuing to expand from there. I mean, I think Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz book's a great place to start for a lot of people, and then hopefully gets people to look more towards tribally specific histories and tribally specific methodologies. But absolutely, great. But both are new beginnings.
Okay, really last one, sorry.
Thank you all for being here, by the way. I was just wondering, is there a distinction between settler colonialism and corporate colonialism?
I'd say that, that I've never heard of that before because I think that corporate colonialism would be trying to give corporations citizenshiphood, personhood. And so we don't want to do that. And however, corporations do colonize through their actions as human beings who run those corporations. And I think that, unfortunately, I recently read unfortunate actions that corporations in other countries gain rights as citizenships, as citizens, as a corporation, and so that they're able to manipulate laws that as not being treated unfairly as a corporation because they're a citizen. And so I think that that is a way to manipulate the people of that land. And so language has to be questioned when you use it. I wouldn't want to use corporate, whatever, I can't even think of what you said. But it's human beings that run those corporations that are settlers, and not the corporation as an entity that is doing this stuff on its own. Multinational corporations are evil, but it's the people that are running them that need to be held accountable. I think that's what I have to say about that.
I might follow up with corporations historically have practiced, have been happy to employ settler colonialism and a number of other forms of colonialism, which are also bad. So, yes, it's a tool used by corporations historically. They also use traditional colonialism and a number of other exploitative tools historically, depending on the corporation.
I feel like this may be the next panels. So there's obviously nothing that people feel like to do more than continue to talk about this and recommend books, but we should respect people's time. You can know where to reach the people on the panel. Otherwise, they can just email them, come to their office hours, read books and articles. And thank you all very much for coming out and for staying so late. Thanks once again to